pod whirled past the academy, where the other children were still fighting in the foodarium, down through the forest, up a ramp and onto the hover strip to join a speeding blur of traffic. It sped towards the tall glass buildings of the new town. Bennett jumped up on his hind legs and pressed his nose excitedly to the window. Will found himself gazing excitedly out the window as well. Around them streamed hoverpods of different shapes, colours and sizes. Soon the buildings of the new town were flying by, one after the other, as the hoverpods sped under the sky bridges that connected them. Suddenly it seemed a long, long time since he had travelled in a pod. Will thought about that. Almost 3 months had gone by since the academy's speed pod had picked him up from home and brought him to the academy. And for the past month, since Dr. Fugg had cancelled the cultural outings, there had been no exit from the academy at all. Yet all the time, outside the academy in the forest on the hill with its lawns and its playing fields and its daily routine, the rest of the world had been living its own life. People still came and went from the tall buildings that he was passing. Their pods still sped and swerved to avoid each other on the hover strips of the city. None of this had stopped as the weeks had gone by in the academy, as events there had got stranger and stranger. Suddenly the academy seemed like a kind of prison, and he was out. It seemed very far away, almost unreal. Will glanced at Stanley and Davina. They were staring out the windows as well. Maybe they were thinking the same things. They continued to move in the speeding stream of hoverpods until they were at the other side of the new town. Then the pod tilted. It veered across the hover strip, bobbing to avoid the traffic, and swung onto an exit slip. Rapidly, it began to drop, following the curve of the slip. The ride became bumpy and uneven. There were no other hoverpods around them here. Will looked up. He could see the underside of the hover strip they had just left, running high above them on massive concrete pillars. And when he looked down, he could see the red brick walls of the old town into which they were descending. The hoverpod moved slowly over cracked, broken streets. Bricks and fallen lampposts and other debris were strewn across the roads. There were rusting, burned-out hulks of old vehicles. The pod manoeuvred carefully to get around them. Nothing else stirred. The streets were silent. Still. The mood inside the pod had turned nervous and apprehensive. Bennett retreated to Stanley's lap. The children gazed outside as the pod continued to inch forward. Black windows yawned back at them, long emptied of glass. Walls had crumbled and piles of red brick rubble lay on the ground, with sickly yellow weeds growing out of the cracks. Green stains of moss showed where water ran down the walls. Other stains of chemicals, yellow and brown and orange, blotched the buildings and the roads. No one spoke. They wondered what kind of a place this had once been, what kind of people had once lived here, and who, if anyone, might live here now. The hoverpod continued along the street. It turned a corner. More of the same. Rubble. Ruins. The pod moved past a strange vehicle lying on its side. Its underbelly showed rusted pipes like the corroded intestines of some long-dead beast. Further along the street, the front wall of a building had fallen away completely, exposing the pale interiors of ancient rooms green with mould, together with a staircase that ran from one floor to the next and then stopped in mid-air. The hoverpod turned another corner. It glided to one side of the street and sank to the ground. Deacon Street, leaders. They peered out of the windows along the ruined street. Is this the correct location, leaders? They glanced at one another. Are you sure this is Deacon Street, Masterson? Said Will. Yes, Bartholomew Jenkins. Then it's the right location, Masterson. Very good, Bartholomew Jenkins, said the pod, and an instant later the door slid open. Warm, damp air rushed into the pod. No one moved. Do you wish to go elsewhere, Bartholomew Jenkins? Said the hoverpod eventually. Yes, thought Will, anywhere. No, Masterson, he said. The hoverpod was silent. Wait for us here, Masterson, said Will. Very good, Bartholomew Jenkins. Will took a deep breath. He got out. Davina followed, then Stanley. Come on, Bennett, said Stanley. You wanted to come. And he grabbed Bennett's legs and dragged him out. The door of the hoverpod closed behind them. They walked down the street, picking their way over bricks, wires and poles, looking around at the ruined buildings on either side of them. Halfway down the street, a building of 6 or 7 stories had tumbled almost entirely to the ground, leaving only one corner reaching to its full height out of a massive pile of red rubble, like a single jagged finger pointing into the sky. Beyond it, another building stood with its walls intact, yet every window was empty. Grass and weeds sprouted from cracks in the stairs that led to its open doorway. "Are you sure this is the right street, Will?" asked Davina. "This is what Mr. Krantz said," Will replied. "The school on Deacon Street." "How will we even know the school when we see it?" "From that sign," said Stanley. He pointed across the road. A brick fence ran along the edge of the street, part of it still standing waist high, part of it collapsed on the ground. At one end of the fence, on the part that was still standing, was an old wooden sign, hanging at an angle and held up by a single rusting nail. Will tilted his head. Much of the lettering on the sign had disappeared. Will thought he could make out the word school. And something else. Bill, perhaps, or hill. He looked beyond the fence. There was a wide expanse of concrete, buckled and broken into pieces, like a crust of toffee that had cracked. Through the cracks grew grass and weeds and even a couple of small twisted trees. Will glanced back along the street. The hoverpod, gleaming black where they had left it, seemed far away now. It was the only thing that was new and shiny in this landscape of ruins. "Come on," said Davina. They walked past the sign on the fence. On the other side of the concrete yard was a large, low building, only 2 stories high. The windows overlooking the yard were empty, like the windows in every other building in the street, and the door had disappeared from its doorway, but there was a roof on the building and the walls were preserved. Beside the doorway was a stone plaque set into the wall. The words cut into the stone were still legible. Gower Hill High School. Beneath the words was a date. 2006, murmured Stanley. "Must be when they built it," said Will. "I wonder when they last used it," said Davina. They went inside. They were in a kind of entrance hall. There was a big hole in the roof above them and a shaft of sunlight came through. Suddenly there was a noise in the air and a flock of something, birds or bats, came flapping and shrieking towards them. They ducked and the animals went over their heads, brushing them with their wings. Then they were gone. Will looked around. 3 corridors led from the hall. "That one?" he said, pointing to the middle one. The others shrugged. They weren't splitting up, that was for sure. They went into the corridor. There were rooms on either side. Bennett trotted close to Stanley. There was an old, dank, musty smell in the air, and bird droppings splattered the floor, which was thick with dust and littered with bits of wood and fragments of glass and tiles. They crunched and sometimes stumbled over the shifting debris. From time to time, a stray bat flew at them down the corridor. The walls on either side of the corridor were only shoulder high, and above that had once been glass, but most of the glass was gone, and sharp, dangerous-looking shards protruded from the frames. The rest of the glass lay in pieces on the floor, cracking into even smaller pieces under their feet. Some of the rooms were empty. In others, there were a few small tables and chairs, all scattered around and lying on their sides. There were a few plastic box-like things as well, lying in the dust. "Early computers," said Stanley. "You're not serious," exclaimed Davina. "I've seen pictures of them before." They went into a room. Stanley rolled one of the box-like things over with his foot. "See? This one's got a screen." Davina and Will laughed. "All the computers in school put together probably had less computing power than Bennett." Bennett grinned. He sniffed around the computer. "Careful, Bennett," said Will. "That's probably your grandfather." "Very funny," growled Bennett, and he turned away from the old computer in the dust. They left the room. They reached another corridor. Here the building was better preserved. Some of the glass remained intact in the frames, and there was less debris underfoot. Suddenly, Bennett stopped. "What is it, Ben?" asked Stanley. "People," growled the dog. "Where, boy?" "There," said Bennett, and he pointed a foreleg down the corridor. They moved forward slowly. Bennett was right. Soon they could hear voices. They came to a turn in the corridor. The voices were coming from around the corner. Cautiously, Will peered around. He ducked back. He glanced at Stanley and Davina and put a finger to his lips. Then he went around the corner and ran quickly to the other side, keeping his head down and hunched low beside the wall. Davina followed, and then Stanley. Bennett skidded across the corridor after them. They crouched against the wall. Above them, the glass in the upper part of the wall was intact. The voices were coming from the other side. Will looked at Stanley and Davina. 1, 2, 3, he whispered. They put their heads up for an instant and all ducked down. Hello, whispered Bennett. Stanley sighed. He grabbed Bennett, pushed him up for a second, then pulled him down. I don't believe you, Stanley, whispered Davina. They were all hunched against the wall again, below the level of the glass. They only had an instant to look into the room, and in that instant each one of them had noticed different things. But there was something in the room that none of them had failed to see. People. About a dozen of them, men and women, and they were all really old, with white hair and wrinkled faces. They were dressed in odd, old-fashioned clothes, the kind of clothes you saw in pictures of people from the time of the Wizard Wars. That must be them, Will whispered. Stanley nodded. What should we do? Whispered Davina. Will thought. They like pranks, he said, remembering Mr. Crance's amusement at all the pranks children used to play on him. Pranks? Whispered Stanley doubtfully. Bennett should be good at pranks, said Will. Bennett nodded his head quickly, showing his tongue, which was ready to lick anyone's face. Not that, said Davina. I know. Suddenly she jumped up and rapped her fingers on the glass. The voices inside the room stopped. She reached up and rapped the glass again. Hello, she cried, and then she ran off around the corner. Will, Stanley and Bennett stared at each other for a moment and then ran after her. They stopped around the corner and listened. They heard a voice. Who's there? Davina grinned. Who was that? Where are you? They could hear footsteps coming closer. Someone came around the corner. Boo! Yelled Davina, and she jumped in the air with her arms above her head and a grimace on her face. Oh my! Cried an old lady with a big bun of white hair on her head, and she clutched at her chest, staggering backwards. What is it, Miss Wilkins? Called an old man, coming around the corner behind her. Other old people followed. This girl, said the lady. Oh, Mr. Berger, I think she's given me a heart attack. And she swooned against the man's shoulder. Now, you'll be all right, Miss Wilkins, said the man, although Miss Wilkins looked far from all right. She was pale and shaky, and she continued to lean against him, taking deep breaths and fanning her face with her hand. The man looked at the children sternly. Who are you? What are you doing? It was just a prank, replied Davina. We didn't think we were going to kill her. A prank? The last time a child played a prank like that on me, I gave him detention for 2 weeks running. Yes, but that was 50 years ago, Mr. Berger, said one of the other teachers, who were all crowding around now. She hasn't really had a heart attack, has she? Asked Will. Perhaps she has, said Mr. Berger, and Miss Wilkins turned a wan face on Davina and nodded to show that perhaps, in fact, she had. The other teachers were glaring at them as well. Suddenly, one of them clapped. Come on, you three! In you come! No more shilly-shallying! And all the teachers stood and stared sternly as the 3 children, together with Bennett, marched across the corridor. The room was unlike any other room in the school that they had seen. The first thing that struck them was colour. It wasn't drab and grey with dust like every other room. They had noticed this even in their first hurried glimpse through the glass. Now they saw the details. The floor was yellow and there were green blinds on the windows on the other side. There was a large brown desk at the front. A big board of some kind of white material hung on the wall behind it. At the back, the wall was plastered with colourful maps and charts, and the room itself was filled with rows of yellow and red desks, each incorporating one of the old computers. Sit, commanded Miss Wilkins, who seemed to have recovered from her heart attack by the time all the teachers had filed back into the classroom. The other teachers were obviously accustomed to her taking charge. She pointed at the front row of desks. Well, quickly now, don't try to hide down at the back. Will, Stanley and Davina sat. Then Stanley got up and put Bennett on the 4th chair in the row and sat down again. The teachers watched in disapproval. A dog, murmured one of them. In the classroom, muttered another. Wouldn't have happened in my classroom, said a third. Wouldn't have happened in any of our classrooms, I'm sure, said Miss Wilkins, and she turned around and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, picked up a marker and wrote in big capital letters, "Dogs are not to be brought into the classroom." "What does that say, Master?" whispered Bennett. "Is it something good?" Miss Wilkins turned around and stared at Stanley. "Can you read, boy?" Stanley nodded. "Is that clear?" "Yes," mumbled Stanley. "Yes, what?" demanded Miss Wilkins. "Yes, it is," suggested Stanley. "Yes, Miss Wilkins," retorted Miss Wilkins and stared expectantly at Stanley. "Yes, Miss Wilkins," muttered Stanley. Miss Wilkins stared at the others. "Yes, Miss Wilkins," said Will. "Yes, Miss Wilkins," said Davina. "Yes, Miss Wilkins," said Bennett. Miss Wilkins stared at Bennett. "Dogs do not talk," she said. "I do," said Bennett. "Not in my classroom." "He's a road dog," explained Stanley. "I programmed him." "Then you can deprogram him," said Miss Wilkins. "By tomorrow, young man. Next time he comes to the classroom, I want him silent." "But I'm not supposed to bring him to the classroom," said Stanley. "That's what you just wrote." Miss Wilkins stared. Her eyes narrowed. Suddenly she pointed to the words on the whiteboard behind her. "You can write that out 100 times. That'll teach you to be rude." Stanley glanced at Will. This was very strange. How was writing the sentence out 100 times going to teach him to be rude? He didn't see how it was going to teach him anything. Besides, he didn't see why Miss Wilkins would want to teach him to be rude in the first place. Will shrugged. He had no idea either. "What are your names, children?" inquired Mr. Berger. They told him. "I'm Bennett," added Bennett. But the teachers seemed to have lost interest in him now. They crowded together in front of the three children, gazing at them, looking at them first from one angle and then from another, as if there was some kind of exquisite and unexpected gifts waiting to be unwrapped, peering at them with delight and fascination. "Children," whispered one. "Real children," murmured another. "I never thought I'd see the day," said a third. "I haven't taught a child in 40 years, said a fourth. "We'll start with mathematics, of course," said a fifth. "History," said another. "Geography." "We're doing mathematics." "History." "Literature." "Science." "Art." "Reading." "Music." "Woodwork." "Geography." "I said mathematics," said the mathematics teacher. "Mathematics is more important than anything." And he gnashed his teeth at the geography teacher, who gnashed her teeth right back. Others gnashed as well. They were all shouting at each other when they weren't gnashing, all demanding to teach their own subject. Some were starting to push and shove. The three children glanced at each other in disbelief. Bennett gazed hopefully at Stanley, tongue hanging out, waiting for a signal. Finally, Stanley nodded. Bennett leapt off his chair, bounded across 2 desks and launched himself onto the shoulder of one of the teachers with a yelp of delight. 3 good licks on the face, and he was onto another shoulder. And another. Soon the teachers had stopped shouting and were waving their arms around, grimacing and wincing and wiping Bennett's slobber off their faces. "Come back, boy," said Stanley, and Bennett gave Miss Wilkins, whose shoulder he was sitting on, one last sloppy lick across the ear, sniffed at her bun and leapt back to Stanley. Bennett sat in Stanley's arms, panting and grinning with pleasure. The last of the teachers wiped his slobber away. Will stood up. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," he said loudly, hands on hips. "What do you think you're doing?" The teachers glanced at him ruefully. "It's been so long since we had the chance to teach anyone," one of them muttered, glancing at him sheepishly. "I think we got a bit excited," murmured another. "We haven't come here to be taught," said Will. The teachers frowned. They looked at one another in confusion. "What have you come here for?" asked Miss Wilkins. "Barnaby Krantz sent us," said Will. Will didn't know exactly what that meant to the teachers, but it certainly meant something. Some of them gasped. Some of them frowned. Some of them stared at him with wide, astonished eyes, as if struck dumb with shock. "Who sent you, did you say?" said Miss Wilkins. "Mr. Krantz. Is he here?" "No," replied Miss Wilkins. "He most certainly is not." Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.